Guys, interesting things have just happened in Beijing. So, China had its China Africa Forum, and 52 out of the 53 African states were present in Beijing, during which Xi Jinping gave his address. And in his address, he mentioned that he's going to, not he personally, but China is going to allocate $50 billion for development projects across Africa within the next 3 years. Now, I took a note. So, this development project is going to cover, it's going to fund infrastructure, it's also covering military support, and it's going to provide 1 million jobs to Africa within the next 3 years. Then, another thing he said, usually when we look at China Africa relations, it's usually around um, economic. But certain things, first of all, when I saw this military support, I'm like, wow, because usually, although China is also a player in military support in Africa, but it's not like the top dogs. When it comes to African military support, the top dogs, United States and Russia. In fact, Russia is even more in certain African nations because I believe that Russia's weapons are more affordable than American weapons. So anyway, now that China is wants to get into the military game, and so like I said, we are used to economy with China's relationship with Africa, but now I'm seeing military support. Another interesting thing is politics. So here, this is a quote. China also mentioned, okay, not really a quote, but I wrote it down. Now, Xi Jinping also said that they are raising the relationship between Africa, all African nations that have diplomatic relations with China. They are raising this relationship to strategic relationship. This means that Africa is becoming very important in China's foreign policy now that the relationship has been raised to strategic. Do you know what it means for a country to say my relationship with you is strategic? Meaning that our futures are kind of intertwined. Very interesting. Very interesting indeed. The way the world is moving, and particularly with this whole geopolitics conflict, not really conflict, this more geopolitics posturing where every country is trying to say, okay, you're either on my side or you're not on my side, and this is how we're going to, for example, we're going to preserve America's future. To preserve one of the episodes of the Amanda Show I had some weeks ago, I mentioned that a think tank funded by the US, by the Pentagon in the United States, suggested that for United States to get access to important graphite, it needs to take its relationship with East Africa more seriously. Do you get? Because now that the world is shifting, so every country now, particularly the big players like Russia, China, United States, these big players are beginning to look for how do we protect our future? How do we ensure that our country keeps developing and growing? So this is to me, I think this is one of the reasons why China is raising its relationship with African countries to strategic. Now, like I was mentioning, the way the world is moving to not it's not completely moving, but it's beginning to incorporate elements of this whole green energy. Africa is a critical source of this energy. There is no place on the planet. There is no place on the planet that you can say like this is where I'm coming to find everything I need. Not just even if you think about it, not just with the whole green energy thing, even with our normal um I don't want to call it fossil fuels, even with our normal trusted petroleum products like crude oil and natural gas, even with those things, Africa is where you know you're sure you can get it. So China is doing this now because it has realized that its future, since the world is divided into pole, like in this multipolar world, what is like the world is divided into sections. China is trying to protect its own section, how to because some minerals now that China would not have, or some things that China would not have. It wants to be friends with several other places to ensure it gets uninterrupted supply of those things because United States is going to be trying to outclass or outdo China in certain areas. So this is what is going on. Now, beyond that, during this China Africa forum, one of the critical issues that Africa has faced, which would now China is the biggest trade, Africa's biggest trade partner in countries mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but I think in Africa, China's biggest trade partner is South Africa. One of the issues we've had, like one of the main issues we've had with relationship with economic relationship with China, is that our importation from China, it's not just an African thing. China is the world's manufacturing behemoth. So everything the world needs, China supplies the world with it. But looking at it in the context of Africa, our importation from China is way more than our exports to China. So to address this, the Chinese are thinking of um, opening their markets to more goods from African countries, 33 African countries, if I'm not mistaken. And of these 33 African countries, these goods are going to come into China at zero tariff. It's a good thing. But here's where I still think that no matter what China tries to do, Africa will still kind of have a back leg. It'll still be like, it's still not going to be playing from a strong position, mostly because we do not have local production. That is with local production that you are adding value to things that are gotten from here. And it's when you add value to things that are gotten from here, you can make more money. Because even if China said, okay, we are opening our market completely to all African nations, because we are not sending out value added products, we are still going to be getting it on the cheap because we are selling just raw materials. Say we are supplying China we are supplying China with, say, we are supplying China with cobalt, for example. Even if China says, okay, 0%, no, we're not putting any tariff on this thing, no matter how much we send, we can never make up for what we get import from China because China is adding, and this is not the Chinese problem. Like, it's not all because China has so outsmarted Africa. It's because of the way African nations have run their economy since even before independence, because even when the Europeans were still in control of all African nations, it was just the system that has been in place. So that's why now more than ever, we need to begin to we need to take this local production very seriously. And it's the same thing, like earlier this year, we had the South Korea Africa Forum. And during that South Korea Africa Forum, things like this were agreed that they were going to increase bilateral trade. In fact, African nations can keep bringing in more of their goods. But that's the same problem. Whatever we get from South Korea is going to be value added products. And whatever we send to South Korea is going to be raw material. So no matter what happens, African nations are still going to be playing on a back foot because we haven't set up things like this. Now more than ever, this is where we need to take it very seriously. And I'm saying this not because I've said this several on this show, not because I'm expecting that one president of an African nation is watching this show, at least not yet, or maybe I don't even know. But I'm saying it because of you who is watching me. Now is the time to take the responsibility for the development of Africa into our hands. I know things are not easy on the continent. In several countries on the continent, things are not easy, but we should move in spite of what we see on ground. Because if at all we are going to, if let's say every country in the world decides to open up and say, all right, give us all African goods, we don't have goods to export. Now, having said that, I also want to discuss. When when this news came out, the whole world is like, wow, $50 billion is not a small thing anyway. Oh wow, $50 billion, $50 billion in 3 years for African nations, blah 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 blah, 1 million jobs and all these things. So it's more like China is beginning to look like, oh, our savior, the savior of Africa, and I don't like that. Now, I'm not saying that relationship with China is not in Africa's interest. It's in Africa's interest. We've seen that many of these infrastructure projects, even if they come out and say debt trap, I've said it before on the show, there's little evidence to prove that China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy in Africa. If there's a debt trap diplomacy taking place in Africa, it's with the IMF and the World Bank and all these Western lenders and also private lenders. That is the debt trap. So here's the thing now, like I was saying, the issue I have with this movement, with this thing, is that China is beginning to look like, oh, our savior, our knight in shining armor, the guy who is going to help Africa, the guy who is going to pull Africa out of poverty and develop Africa. China is one country. Yes, it's a rich country, and yet it has been one of Africa's friends. Even before now, even when China was not even something that nations were thinking about. It was a debt poor country. China and Africa has always had good relations. Well, I want us to. I'm saying this because I want us to look away from thinking that some guy or some country is coming to help us. No, anything that China is going to do in Africa, even if there's evidence to show that it's actually beneficial relationship, or whatever China is going to do in Africa, is not because the Chinese are philanthropists. Anything China is coming to do in Africa they are looking at it from China's interest. That is why I mentioned to you when I started this segment. That's why they said The Chinese government mentioned that they're increasing relationship with African nations. All the African nations that have diplomatic relations with China, their relationship is increased to strategic relationship. Why? Because China is looking at it from China's perspective, from Chinese interest. How does this benefit China? So therefore, it is in our own, it is imperative for Africans to then look at it from Africa's interest. Don't think China is coming to pull you out of poverty. I'm saying this clearly. China will do what it can to work with African countries, and definitely the more you transact and do business, the more money you make. But it is not in China's place to bring Africa out of poverty. It's the same way. Don't look at it like Russia is coming to be a knight in shining armor. It is not in Russia's place to bring Africa out of poverty. Russia would do what is in Russia's interest. The same thing with the United States and Europe. In fact, those ones have really funny history anyway, so you cannot even be looking at them for anything. Do you get? But the most important thing I'm saying this is because Africans, we need to begin to look at ourselves and realize that the wealth and the prosperity of Africa is dependent on us. It's dependent on Africans, both the government and the people. China is not our father. China is not the father African nations run to when they need financial support. If we have been thinking of China like that, we need to begin to remove that thought from our head because every country will work in its interest. China is here not because, oh, it so loves Africa. Mm-mm. China is here because Africa has what it needs, meaning that Africa has what China needs. That is why China is here. It's the same reason why the Russians are here. It's the same reason why the Americans are here. It's the same reason why you keep hearing that, oh, they want to engage in information, and they want to engage in propaganda. I said that in the last episode of this show. They want to engage in propaganda to paint France, United States, and really Western countries in a good light compared to other players like Russia and China. It's not because they so care about you. It's not. It's because they care about what is in your country and on the continent. So if at all we are serious about pulling Africa out of poverty, if at all we want to make Africa a formidable player on the global stage, we need to look at ourselves that we are responsible for the story of Africa. We are responsible for the wealth of Africa. And that's one of the things I love about China. You see, I look at China, and I think other Africans should begin to, particularly leaders, should begin to look at China like this. I look at China and I see what is possible. Let's not forget that just a few decades ago, it's not so long. Many of our parents were alive. Many of us are even watching this. Were alive when this thing was going on. China was a death poor nation. I remember even back then, there was a documentary I was watching some weeks ago. Yes, was it a documentary or a book? No, it was a book. It's a book I'm reading. It's a book. It's not a documentary. The book is titled "Why Nations Fail." So I'm reading that book, and one important argument that the authors of that book stated is that back then, right now they tell you that Africa is poor because our culture is backward, because this is backward and that is backward, so that's why Africa is poor, blah blah blah. But here's the argument. One of the arguments that were made in that book is that when China was poor, the same thing was said about the Chinese. They said the Chinese are lazy people. They said the Chinese culture is backward. They said the Chinese culture encourages laxing and not doing anything. Oh, communism is the reason for all of China's worries and all of China's problems. That was what was said. But now that the script has flipped, and flipped by who? The Chinese made sure that the script flipped. Now that the script has flipped and China is no longer a poor nation, the whole story has changed. Oh, the Chinese are so hardworking. Oh, the Chinese are so intelligent. It's the same thing between Africa. So I'm looking at China and this country. I've not been to China, but I'm planning to travel to China hopefully sometime next year. Because that's how I see this nation. I see it like this thing is possible. Coming out of poverty, even the kind that China suffered is possible. There was nothing in China. Coming out of poverty is possible. If one of the things they even tell us that responsible for Africa's poverty is population. Africa's overpopulation, which is not true. Which is not true. Let's look at it. If we say Africa altogether, all 50, 53, 53, 54 countries of Africa put together, and even those countries that are saying they are countries, but the international community does not recognize them, put all of us together. We just barely surpassed 1 billion a few years ago. A whole continent. surpassed 1 billion a few years ago. So Africa does not have an overpopulation problem. Africa has an underdevelopment problem, not overpopulation problem. So sometimes when these economists say, "Oh, Africa is poor because of their population," it's not true. It's not true. The most populous nation in Africa is Nigeria. Nigeria is sitting at just 220 million, or maybe 200 million. Let's put it at that. That is what Nigeria is sitting at. When China brought its people out of poverty, how many were they? How many? They were a lot. They were several times more than Nigeria. Okay, look at India now. That India is pulling people out of poverty, and a lot more Indians are getting into the middle class. Although there's still a lot of poverty in India, but a lot more Indians are getting into the middle class. How many are they? India is 1 point something billion, because we're watching India's development right in front of us. India is 1 point something billion. Africa completely is 1 billion. Nigeria is 220 million. Now you put Nigeria's 220 million and contrast with India's 1.3 billion. If 1.3 billion can work in bringing people out of poverty, why 200 million? How is 200 million a complicated thing? Do you understand where I'm coming from? So I look at China as a very inspirational model, as a huge inspiration for Africa to see this is what is possible. So instead of we to just come out and say, "Oh, China will take all our problems away, China will come and help Africa," instead of we to take that approach, let us look at what China did in their country and say, or let's look at what the Chinese did in their country and say, how can we implement this in Africa? Because instead of us to go and be say, "Oh, give us 50 billion," we need to get to the point where it's African nations that are giving other nations money. It's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea that something is going on in, say, in Haiti, Dominican Republic, in the Bahamas. There's been something is going on. Why can't African nations say, "All right, we'll give you 10 billion"? Why can't it? What is wrong in Nigeria doing that? What is wrong in South Africa doing that? So this whole thing will begin with our mind. We need to begin to change our mind. It's good that we're working with China. It's good that we're working with Russia. It's good that we're working with the United States and the EU. But to not look at these nations, not one of them, not one is your knight in shining armor. Your only knight in shining armor in Africa is yourself. Africa will be built by Africans, not the Chinese, not the Americans, not the Europeans, not the Russians. So, what do you think about the China Africa forum that just took place? Let me know what you think about it in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with your friends so that we reach more people across the continent.